For 13 years, Pastor Daniel Whitaker vanished from St. Andrew's Church, leaving a town haunted by whispers, grief, and unanswered questions. Harold Barnes and Glenn Matthews, trusted elders of the church, betrayed that trust, hiding a deadly secret beneath the very sanctuary they led. But when Daniel's hidden journal and letters were finally uncovered, the truth emerged, exposing their crimes and vindicating his name. And just wait until you see how the town finally confronted the betrayal, and why justice prevailed in a way that no one saw coming. The summer of 2009 in Hollow Creek, Kentucky, was the kind of season where the air felt heavy, even after sunset. The little town was quiet, wrapped in its routines. Children chasing fireflies along gravel roads, neighbors rocking on porches, the familiar chime of the church bell at St. Andrew's echoing through the valley. That bell was more than sound. It was ritual, the thread tying generations of townsfolk to faith, to order, to a sense of safety. And at the heart of it all stood Pastor Daniel Whitaker, a man whose presence seemed as steady as the stone walls of the church he led. That evening, Daniel had delivered what some parishioners later described as one of his most stirring sermons. The topic was forgiveness, not the simple kind found in small arguments, but the kind that demands surrender, the kind that digs into secrets and sins people would rather bury. He had stood behind the pulpit with a solemn weight in his voice, pausing often as though measuring each word. He spoke about how truth, no matter how long concealed, never stays hidden forever. People nodded, murmured amens, and bowed their heads in thought. They didn't know it would be the last time they would hear his voice. The congregation filed out into the warm night, the parking lot buzzing with polite goodbyes and talk of Sunday dinners. Daniel remained behind a few minutes longer, tidying his notes, sliding his worn Bible into the crook of his arm. Witnesses later said he looked distracted, as if his mind was chasing something heavier than Scripture. Some thought it was exhaustion. He worked tirelessly, visiting shut-ins, counseling struggling families, filling his days with the burdens of others. No one suspected it was something else. By morning, the world shifted. Daniel was gone. It was Mary, his wife of 18 years, who noticed first. He hadn't come home after the sermon, but that wasn't unusual on a late church night. Sometimes he stayed late to lock up or to offer a listening ear to a troubled parishioner. But by dawn, when his side of the bed was still cold, worry pressed in on her. She drove to the church, praying the whole way. His car was there, parked neatly in its usual spot, dust rising around her tires as she pulled up beside it. The doors were locked. Through the window she saw his Bible resting on the passenger seat, pages marked with folded notes, as if he had intended to bring it home. Panic clawed at her chest. She called his name through the empty sanctuary, her footsteps echoing against wooden pews. The building was silent. No Pastor Whitaker. The search began within hours. Police combed the fields surrounding the church, their flashlights sweeping through tall grass. Volunteers waded into the shallow banks of Hollow Creek itself, boots sinking into mud, calling out his name. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades rattling the rooftops of barns and silos. Officers checked hospitals, highway motels, and local jails. Nothing. It was as if the man had been lifted straight out of the night air. Mary appeared on television 2 days later, her face pale, her voice shaking as she begged for help. She clutched a framed photo of Daniel, a strong man in his early 40s, neatly trimmed beard, gentle eyes, a presence that radiated calm. "Please," she said, staring into the camera, "if anyone knows where my husband is, bring him home." Her desperation pierced through the screen, and yet no calls came. In a place like Hollow Creek, where everyone knew everyone, the disappearance felt impossible. Here was a pastor who baptized their children, officiated their weddings, prayed over their dead, and now he had simply vanished. Theories bloomed like weeds. Some whispered he'd run away from the pressures of leadership. Others muttered about foul play. Farmers at the diner shook their heads in disbelief. Mothers pulled their children a little closer, unsettled by the thought that even a man of God wasn't safe. Each day that passed without answers deepened the wound. Parishioners still filled the pews, but the silence from the pulpit grew unbearable. The church bell rang on Sunday mornings, but its sound carried grief instead of comfort. Police press conferences dwindled, hope flickered, and what began as a frantic community search faded into a grim reality. Daniel Whitaker was gone, leaving behind a locked car, an untouched Bible, and a town suffocating under the weight of questions. No one could answer. Hollow Creek had lost its pastor. What no one realized yet was that the night of his disappearance would fracture the town in ways they couldn't imagine, and that the truth, buried deep, was waiting to resurface when they least expected it. They began at first with prayer. The first Sundays after Daniel Whitaker vanished, the pews filled with swollen faces and trembling hands. Hymnals were held like lifelines as the congregation sang through tight throats, and casseroles multiplied on Mary's doorstep because routine felt like armor against the ache. People wanted order. Ritual was how Hollow Creek kept chaos at bay, and so they prayed for the pastor they trusted to steady their lives. Prayer circles, candlelight vigils, drives along lonely back roads late at night. The town did what a small town does when one of its anchors disappears. But ritual could not hold back the weather of suspicion that followed. Weeks eroded into months, and the neat lines of solidarity began to fray. When there are no answers, people make explanations. Uncertainty is intolerable, and in its place, communities invent narratives. In Hollow Creek, those narratives split along familiar fault lines: friendship and rivalry, faith and pragmatism, those who loved Daniel without question, and those who, bruised by desperation, wanted something firmer than prayer. Rumors arrived like rain, slow at first, then incessant. Someone said they'd seen Daniel in town late at night with a woman whose name was whispered but rarely spoken aloud. Another claimed he had been seen arguing on the courthouse steps about money. A third said he owed more than the church knew. A fourth suggested a scandal so small-town and salacious it promised to keep tongues wagging for a generation. None of these stories had evidence, but each was a lantern in the dark for somebody who needed to be right. Motivation can be simple and local. For the faithful defenders, women like Ruth Bell, who had brought Daniel into the parish and whose family had been baptized by his hand, defending his name was defending a personal history. They'd felt the comfort of his sermons in hard times. To accuse him now was to tear at threads of their own identity. Their loyalty was not naive. It was the product of gratitude, fear, and an unwillingness to believe the man who had married their children also harbored betrayal. To confess he might be culpable was to confess that the moral scaffolding of their lives could fail. So they closed ranks. They refused to entertain speculation. They organized prayer vigils, and they equated doubt with sacrilege. On the other side were parishioners driven by a different, quieter necessity: self-preservation. Men like Tom Rivers, who ran the feed store and chaired the church finance committee, found themselves in a precarious role. The church was not only a spiritual home, it was a hub of social capital and civic responsibility. Questions about stewardship, donations, and who made decisions could no longer be postponed. Tom's calls for transparency, ledgers opened, meetings recorded, were framed by some as cold and by others as moral duty. His motives were layered, a genuine demand for accountability mixed with an instinct to protect his livelihood and reputation. In a town where blaming the absent man is safer than looking inward, skepticism became a political stance as much as a moral one. Mary Whitaker's motives were the simplest and most stubborn of all. She stayed because leaving would be an admission that she had misread her life, that her marriage could be severed by rumor. She stayed because Hollow Creek was not a place people uprooted from easily. Her family, the mortgage, the church basement where volunteer dinners were hosted. Life was knitted to place. She stayed because she had to raise Ethan. Worse, she stayed because to go would be to let the story be written without her voice in it. Grief made her public pleas raw and relentless. Every interview, every desperate statement on local news was a negotiation between hope and denial. People heard the same sentence: "He would never abandon us." and parsed it differently, as faith, as delusion, as protective instinct. Her visibility made her an easy target for both sympathy and suspicion. Ethan, just 10 when his father vanished, aged into an absence that shaped his manners and friendships. Children are blunt about what adults hedge around. Classmates asked flat questions that pried at old wounds. "Why'd your dad leave?" "Is he dead?" The scaffolding of playground cruelty forced Ethan to learn the brittle rules of small-town grief. He watched adults speak in half-sentences, saw neighbors avert eyes when his name passed through a conversation, and learned that silence could be weaponized. Some teachers tried to shield him, others treated him as someone to be pitied or resented. As he grew, the weight of the unanswered question hardened into purpose. He learned to read faces for truth the way his father had once read Scripture. Curiosity became for him a kind of fidelity. The institutional church, meanwhile, slid into politicking. Board meetings that had once concerned heating bills and youth outreach became tribunals. Who would lead Sunday services? Who controlled the payroll? Who had keys and authority? Committees formed and split along allegiances. The defenders accused the inquisitors of shredding faith for gossip. The inquisitors accused defenders of clinging to mythology at the expense of justice. Letters to the church bulletin grew venomous. Polite table conversation at potlucks turned to cold dismissals. The parishioners, who could no longer stomach the strain, left quietly at first, and then in small, indignant groups, finding other churches, new congregations that promised steadier ground. Those who remained attended with clenched jaws, trading cautious glances that mapped alliances more than friendship. Social media, then still a new vector for small-town rumor, amplified everything. A local blog carried speculation into the wider world, comments proliferated, and anonymous accounts whispered facts that had the ring of truth because repetition lends credibility. The sheriff's office, strained and defensive, could provide no proof, and its silence fed the rumor mill. People who favored action called for independent investigators. Others denounced such moves as feeding a gossip culture. A church divided is not merely an organizational failure. It is a social rupture. What began as collective sorrow mutated into accusation, loyalty into tribalism, worry into strategy. Families that had once sat together in worship found themselves in different pews, their eyes curved around the issue like a scar. For Mary and Ethan, the division was intimate. Part of their grief was public, measured in who would bring casseroles and who would cross the street rather than answer their knock. For the town, the split reconfigured relationships and reputations in ways that outlasted gossip. Some doors closed forever, some handshakes carried a weight of judgment that would not be lifted. Years would pass before the question of what really happened gained new traction. In the meantime, Hollow Creek learned the dangerous alchemy of absence, that not knowing breeds stories, and stories become the substitute truth for those who can know, longer bear the weight. The door to St. Andrew's basement had a way of looking like a wound that would not close. For 13 years it sat bolted, a slab of flaking paint and a rusted padlock that caught the light only to refuse it back. A plywood sign, hand-lettered, then yellowing, read, "Basement closed, unsafe." The sign was municipal-sounding and final, the kind of bureaucratic language that turns questions into facts. It told the town what to think, that whatever lay below was contamination and hazard, not consequence. People nodded and moved on. They praised the elders for caution and prayed. They treated the door like a promise broken by time rather than an instruction to be tested. The elders' explanation was simple and plausible. Mold, compromised beams, the kind of rot that comes from old stone and poor gutters. Contractors walked the sanctuary, tap-testing beams and opening their mouths in professional pity. The insurance adjuster signed off on delays. The church bulletin printed polite apologies for canceled potlucks and youth meetings. In public, the explanation consumed the space of reason. Privately, the basement became something else, an absence with a purpose. Ethan Whitaker learned to name that purpose. He was no longer the 10-year-old who had watched his father's car sit in the gravel lot with a Bible on the passenger seat. He had grown into the gap left by that car, patient, stubborn, precise. Where other parishioners found comfort in the adult assurances, "It's unsafe, trust the committee," Ethan found a bar of silence hardened into policy. Silence, he understood, could be applied like mortar. It could hold a structure together or seal whatever someone wanted to keep in. He studied the language the elders used as a man studies a map. Unsafe meant no liability. Structural remediation meant time. Preservation meant expense. He taught himself the contours of those terms. He read municipal codes in the county library until his eyes blurred, learning what an inspector's report required, what a contractor's estimate should look like, what the difference between active mold and cosmetic staining actually was. He took weekend jobs rehabbing houses, grimy, practical work that taught him to look for the fingerprints of shoddy excuses. He learned to read wood grain, to notice fresh caulk where none was needed, to tell when a lock had been wound and wound again. Knowledge became a way to translate the elders' reassurances into questions. The town did not police him for it. They tolerated the son of the missing pastor who refused to let go. Some pitied him. Some watched him with a kind of embarrassment that said, without words, "Let him have this." Mary accommodated his persistence the way a parent accommodates a child's habit, sometimes with quiet agreement, sometimes with weary pleas to step back. She had more reason than most to shield the hole his searching opened. Losing Daniel had already stripped her life of certainties. She accepted that Ethan's pursuit sustained him, even if it frayed her own edges. Her face grew older in the parish kitchen, but she continued to set out plates and answer questions with the same steadiness she'd shown for years. People mistook her for resignation. She was, in truth, endurance. Ethan's work was not cinematic. There were no midnight break-ins, no dramatic confrontations, only the accumulation of small, stubborn facts. He collected receipts from church fundraisers, minute-by-minute accounts of annual meetings, newspaper clippings, and scraps of conversation. He kept them in a green binder with a frayed spine, the ledger of suspicion. He recorded who had keys and when they had been seen entering the building after hours. He interviewed maintenance men who had been hired to replace a shingle or repair a furnace, and who remembered, with the distracted bluntness of laborers, that they had been told in no uncertain terms to stay out of the stairwell. One man, a neighbor who'd once hauled communion furniture, confessed over coffee that he'd once heard an elder on the phone laugh off the basement as "nothing but boxes," and then quickly changed the subject. Those casual contradictions mattered to Ethan because they suggested an alternation between secrecy and carelessness, two strategies that often travel together. He watched the padlock's chain. Some weeks it showed fresh grease, as if someone wanted it to turn smoothly when needed, and other weeks it was caked in rust, as though forgotten. He keyed himself into patterns, who attended extra meetings, who suddenly offered to lead Sunday school for a month, who had been hospitable at funeral luncheons. He made lists and crossed names off and rewrote them. Research became ritual, a different kind of prayer that did not wait for miracles. The silence around the basement became a social mechanism. The town's pauses when the subject came up were as loud as anything shouted. People reflexively diverted conversation away from the church stairs, as if speaking the word basement aloud might break some fragile order. Children learned the rule quickly. They were taught by adults to accept the sign as they accepted the taste of Sunday pancakes. Ethan watched this learning with a mixture of sorrow and calculation. Silence settled into the grooves of memory, filling them with a kind of protective sediment that was difficult to scrape away. He was meticulous about not becoming the angry, reckless outsider people feared. Where some demanded spectacle, he cultivated steadiness. He asked for access politely, then more firmly, then symbolically, offering to fund a structural assessment, to donate labor, to bring in a licensed inspector, and pay out of pocket for whatever remediation the elders claimed was needed. Each offer was politely refused. The reasons given were legal, financial, pastoral. The elders' faces were kind but immovable. When they spoke of stewardship and caution, their words carried the weight of governance. They sounded like people who had learned to hold two truths: the safety of the congregation and the sovereignty of the institution. Ethan felt the institution close around him like a narrowing corridor. His father's absence had taught him to distrust tidy narratives. Daniel's sermons about secrets and truth, lines he had once heard in the warmth of a family pew, replayed in Ethan's head. If his father had been taken from the pulpit, then the pulpit's shadow would stretch long and cold. The locked door at St. Andrews was not merely a physical barrier. It had become a test of wills between a grieving son and a town determined to keep its wounds out of view. So he waited in those small ways that are not passive. He kept records, he listened, he learned. He let the basement's silence sharpen into purpose. Each refusal hardened his resolve rather than blunted it. For 13 years the door held its silence like an oath. For 13 years Ethan turned that silence into a question he refused to stop asking. The storm that struck Hollow Creek in the spring of 2022 was unlike any the town had weathered in decades. The rain began as a steady curtain, then thickened into sheets that blurred headlights and flattened crops. The churchyard at St. Andrews turned to sludge, the gutters choking on debris, until the water pressed against the old stone foundation. By morning, the basement, the forbidden basement, was a drowned cavern. For years it had been sealed with talk of mold and weak beams, but water has no regard for excuses. It seeped under the door, rose along the walls, and filled the space like a truth that would not be contained. Reverend Nathan Cole, who had arrived only 2 years earlier, inherited none of the history, but all of the burden. He was young, bookish, with a calm presence that lacked Whitaker's charisma, but carried its own steadiness. Cole had tried to unite a fractured congregation, preaching less about absolutes and more about endurance. When the floodwaters receded, he walked the building with measured steps, noting warped pews, damp hymnals, and plaster crumbling from ceilings. The basement, however, drew his attention not only because of damage, but because it was his first real look into the part of the church that had long been treated like myth. The lock on the basement door, corroded from years of humidity and now swollen by water, surrendered easily to a crowbar. For the first time in 13 years, the steps downward opened into the damp dark. Workers entered first, boots splashing in ankle-deep water. The air was foul, stagnant with mildew and something metallic that clung to the tongue. They hauled in pumps and generators, dragging hoses through the stairwell to clear the standing pools. The church echoed with the whine of machines, the thud of wet lumber being pried loose. Old boxes dissolved into mush. Furniture swollen with rot collapsed at the touch. Everything that had been stored down there, holiday decorations, broken chairs, cartons of outdated hymnals, was ruined beyond recognition. But destruction has a way of unsealing what preservation conceals. Near the base of the stone steps, where runoff had gouged channels through mortar, one worker's pry bar struck something that gave a hollow clang. Not wood, not stone. Metal. The man crouched, scraping back layers of sludge until the shape emerged, the curved edge of a trunk, its iron fittings bloomed with rust. Wedged tight against the foundation, it had likely been immovable until water softened the earth around it. The floorboards above had hidden it so thoroughly that even those who had once claimed to know the basement never mentioned it. The trunk itself was unimpressive at first glance, ordinary in design, perhaps once painted, but now dulled to a uniform brown of decay. The lock, however, remained, stubborn in its place, though brittle with age. It resisted briefly when tugged, but showed the soft crumble of metal that has long forgotten its own strength. The men paused. Their work had shifted from demolition to discovery. Reverend Cole was summoned. He descended the damp stairs, tie loosened, shoes sinking into muck, and crouched beside the find. His brow furrowed. Whatever lay inside, he knew, could not be handled as simply as broken pews or ruined carpet. The trunk was not just debris, it was potential evidence. In a town haunted by a missing pastor, any hidden container unearthed from beneath church steps carried a weight heavier than iron. Procedure demanded caution. The sheriff's office was called. By law, anything of uncertain origin uncovered during structural work belonged to county authorities until identified. Deputies arrived within the hour, their radios crackling in the sanctuary, boots tracking mud across the tile. With careful hands, they hoisted the trunk from its resting place, its metal scraping the stone as it emerged. The sound echoed, harsh and final, through the hollowed church. Parishioners who had gathered to survey flood damage fell silent as the deputies carried the object up the stairs, its dripping frame leaving a trail across the floor. Once in the light, the trunk looked even more incongruous. Here was a container meant to be opened and closed, hidden instead beneath stone where no hand could reach. Its lock was a relic of an earlier era, hand-forged, its shackle eaten through but still clinging. Some said later that it seemed to groan when lifted, though memory has a way of embroidering discovery with drama. The deputies loaded it carefully into the back of a county vehicle, its weight demanding 2 men to steady it. The congregation watched from the churchyard as the vehicle pulled away, tires hissing against the wet road. Reverend Cole stood among them, hands clasped, his eyes fixed not on the receding car but on the faces of his parishioners. Faces that carried recognition, fear, and a silence that was not surprise so much as confirmation. The trunk was gone from the church within hours, but its shadow remained. The basement, once dismissed as unsafe, was suddenly charged with meaning. Workers resumed their repairs, but their hammers struck with less rhythm, their eyes drifting toward the empty space where the trunk had rested. Parishioners whispered in the pews that Sunday, their voices pitched low, their glances sharp. The discovery had not answered anything. It had only deepened the weight of the question that had hung over Hollow Creek for 13 years. For Ethan Whitaker, standing at the back of the sanctuary that day, the moment was more than a discovery. It was proof that silence could rot, that secrets could be unearthed when the ground itself refused to hold them any longer. The evidence room smelled of bleach and paper. Fluorescent lights hummed low above a long steel table where deputies set the trunk like a mute indictment. It sat between numbered placards and a laptop with a camera already warming for documentation. Reverend Cole and Ethan stood a respectful distance away, faces drawn into the kind of concentration that isn't showy, not public grief, but the private, steady attention of people who had carried absence for years. The room was quiet enough that the scrape of the deputy's gloved hand against rust seemed loud. When the brittle lock finally gave, it did so with a small, almost apologetic clack. The sound was nothing like the dramatic bursts you see in films. It was the noise of old metal finally succumbing to a long, slow pressure. The lid was lifted, and the first breath from the trunk exhaled decades of damp into the air. The smell of old cloth, oxidized metal, and something iron-leaning, faint and metallic, like a memory that had been pressed into the fibers of everything. Inside, the jacket came up first. It was Daniel's suit jacket, a classic cut, wool gone soft at the elbows, a tailor's label stitched inside the collar. The collar itself was darkened at the neckline, the fabric crusted and slightly stiff where whatever stained it had dried into the weave. There was no rush to diagnose what the stain might be. For now it existed as texture and suggestion, something forensic later would test. The jacket was folded carefully, as though someone had once wrapped it and then shoved it in a hurry. Inside a pocket a bus ticket, a hymn slip from a Sunday in 2008, and a clumsy, half-folded note addressed in Daniel's tight, slanted script to Mary were found and set aside in evidence envelopes. Beneath the jacket lay the journal, a leather-bound book swollen at the spine, its edges browned and the cover softened by handling. Daniel wrote small. His letters crowded the margins. He used commas like sighs and underlined phrases that seemed to strike him with a force. The first entries were pastoral and precise: visits, names, dates, the ledger of a man who kept the people in his mind like a roster. But midway through the book, the tone shifted. He began listing figures after names, then circled items, then drew arrows to bracketed notes. Reconcile. Ask about deposit. Compare to receipts. There were pages of arithmetic, penciled sums crossed out and rewritten, and threaded through the EI's calculations, sentences that revealed his motive plainly. He was not a man looking for scandal. He was a man trying to protect a congregation he loved. "I can't let them use people's faith as a bank," one line read, the ink slightly smeared as if his hand had paused, left, and returned. Another entry, dated a few weeks before his disappearance, recorded an awkward meeting he had scheduled with 2 committee members, and beneath it a small, raw line. "If I'm gone, Mary, keep Ethan close." Don't believe the spin. The words were small, intimate, and trembled with foreboding. They felt less like prophecy and more like the private scaffolding of a man bracing for confrontation. Tied with frayed twine were keys of correspondence, letters folded precisely into thirds. Some were clearly drafts, their margins crowded with interlineations. Not for public, to be held if asked. Others were unequivocally addressed to Mary, notes of everyday tenderness, lists of chores, half-jokes about Ethan's hygiene, sentences that ended in the embarrassed kindness of a father. No envelope had been postmarked. These were letters written but not sent, held back maybe out of shame, maybe out of fear, maybe because whatever plan Daniel carried had been interrupted. The heavier material was methodical and ugly in its clarity. Financial ledgers, bound and labeled with dates, lay stacked like the work of someone trying to make sense of a labyrinth. One book was the surface ledger, full of the expected notations. Roof fund, baptism donation, weekly plate. Beneath it, folded and slightly smaller, was a shadow ledger, columns of duplicate entries in a different hand, the ink darker, the handwriting more assured and less pastoral. Deposits that should have matched bank slips didn't. Amounts marked for community outreach appeared again in columns titled Disbursement, with initials beside them. There were photocopies of deposit slips with scribbled endorsements, receipts annotated in ways that suggested reconciliation after the fact. Match to cash, balance to HB, act, transfer, complete paper checks had been photographed, redacted, and stapled to pages. Envelope stubs, handwritten donor names crossed out and replaced with reference numbers, suggested a system designed to obscure origin and destination. What made these documents more than peculiarity was the pattern. The shadow ledger was not random. It repeated 2 sets of initials over and over beside transfers and withdrawals. Where legitimate expenses should have neat trail marks, invoices, vendor numbers, project descriptions, these columns were thin and euphemistic. MISC, outreach, special disbursement, confidential support. The receipts attached to them ranged from grocery store slips to cash withdrawals at ATMs, each small item failing to justify the considerable sums that had moved through the accounts. The implication in the math and the shorthand was plain. Donations intended for the community had been redirected, smoothed into everyday transactions, and in some cases annotated in a way that suggested a prearranged distribution to private accounts. Deputies photographed everything, their flashlights catching grains of dust on the journal's leather and turning ink glints into miniature constellations. Each piece was cataloged, numbered, and placed into evidence bags with stickers and timestamps. They logged serial numbers, described the condition of documents, and noted the presence of handwriting that would later need comparison. All the while, the people in the room read in silence, as if the pages were a text sacred and terrible. Reverend Cole kept his jaw tight, eyes moving over the entries with the clinical attention of a man trying to separate pastoral horror from administrative reality. Ethan, who had lived inside the unanswered space for most of his life, rested his hands on the table long enough to feel the chill through the gloves he'd been given, as if touching the paper might anchor him to truth. The trunk had been buried for years, literal and symbolic. What came out of it was not only the personal scraps of a pastor, but the meticulous architecture of concealment. Ledgers that traced the flow of money away from labeled community accounts into ambiguous disbursements. Letters that read like a man's. Last attempts at accountability and a priest's private ledger of concern. The evidence sat under the fluorescent lights in neat stacks, a quiet geometrical proof that something at St. Andrews had been operating on two different ledgers, one public, one private, and that Daniel had been the kind of man who, once he saw the discrepancy, could not leave it unchallenged. They had been the church's faces for a generation. Harold Barnes with his booming amen and tidy suits. Glenn Matthews with the soothing cadence that made strangers feel seen. Photographs in the fellowship hall showed them flanking Pastor Daniel at ribbon cuttings and charity banquets, hands clasped in prayer at community vigils. Their reputations were scaffolding for St. Andrews, trusted, visible, the people you called when a funeral needed planning or a roof needed fixing. So when the trunk's contents named them, initials repeated like a staccato on page after page, the town felt as if its bones had been rearranged. The shock was immediate and physical. People stopped mid-conversation at the diner. The clink of coffee cups stuttered into silence. News feeds filled with excerpts from the evidence. The shadow ledger's shorthand splashed across screens. HB, Act, G.M. Disby, confidential support. The language on paper was dry, almost administrative, but the implication was combustible. Donations designated for the food pantry, for the roof fund, for the after-school program, money that parishioners had folded into envelopes with quiet faith, appeared to have been routed elsewhere, broken down into cash withdrawals and vague MISC outreach notations. That arithmetic translated into a betrayal that felt elemental. Parishioners had given trust, and two of their stewards may have siphoned it away. Anger met disbelief in equal measure. In the grocery store aisle, a woman who had organized the church's holiday food drives wept quietly into the sleeve of her sweater. At the community center, men who had always deferred to Harold's steady manner now spoke in clipped, incredulous sentences. "If he did this," one man whispered, "how many of our prayers were really just background music for bookkeeping?" Even those predisposed to defend the elders found their voices caught on the page. Faith had been a contract not merely between congregants and God, many felt, but among each other, an implicit promise that those who managed the house of worship would do so with transparency. The ledger suggested those promises had been converted into private ledgers. Harold and Glenn did not fit the cartoon of greed. To understand why they might have chosen such a scheme, the ledger's pattern suggested intent, not accident. You had to look at motives that wore human faces. Harold, a retired contractor, had overseen many of the church's capital projects. He loved the visible work of stewardship. New gutters, fresh paint, a ramp for the elderly, a man whose identity had been fused to doing. Sources close to him described pressure, a failing small business, lingering debts, grandchildren whose college funds had shrunk. For Harold, the ledger could be rationalized, temporary reallocations, loans to tide over shortfalls, an assumption that he would later account for transfers once funds replenished. To salvage the church, he might have told himself, required bending rules. That rationalization is the kind that corrodes ethics slowly. It begins not with malice but with fear and the clumsy arithmetic of survival. Glenn's motive read differently in his smiling photos. He was less ostentatious, the kind of volunteer who logged hours at soup kitchens and spoke up for the elderly at board meetings. But sources reported personal costs, a son with mounting medical bills, a wife's job loss, a mortgage that outpaced retirement checks. Where Harold's pride lay in projects, Glenn's lay in duty. Both, however, shared a sense that private intervention, channeling funds through obfuscated entries, was a way to keep projects and people afloat without alarming donors. Neither man, in interviews before the discovery, had suggested such calculus. After the documents were public, what had once seemed like charity took on an ugly logic. Ends used to justify means. Public reaction hardened into procedure almost overnight. The sheriff's office, which had been cataloging the trunk's contents, announced a preliminary review. Local attorneys began fielding calls from parishioners asking about restitution and civil suits. A bank, nudged by reporters and a concerned trustee, placed temporary holds on certain accounts at the church's request pending audit. At the next Sunday service, attendance swelled not in worship but in vigil. People came to witness, to stand in the sanctuary and see the faces of those implicated. Some brandished petitions demanding resignations from the Finance Committee. Others, still reeling, pleaded for calm and due process. The schism that had simmered quietly for years erupted into public meetings where the word betrayal punctuated nearly every sentence. Harold and Glenn issued statements that read like any crisis management playbook: devout denials, expressions of pain, promises of cooperation. Harold, in a brief press conference at the church door, said, "I have stewarded these funds for decades. I have made mistakes, perhaps in judgment, but never in intent." Glenn, voice low and shaking, told a local reporter he had always acted out of the need to help. Their statements aimed to humanize their actions, to situate them within narratives the Yanni town could understand, imperfect men doing what they thought necessary. That defense, fear, obligation, the slippery logic of private rescue, made some parishioners soften. For others, it was an affront, a rationalization that turned charity into sleight of hand. The moral calculus of the town shifted. Trust, once assumed, became conditional. People combed old donation envelopes, comparing dates, asking questions they had never imagined posing. Volunteers who once showed up unquestioningly to count the plate now wanted bank statements and invoices. The institution of the church, which had relied as much on faith as on social trust, found that the bookkeeping of souls required the same accounting as the books of the bank. In coffee hour corners, conversations bubbled between sorrow and fury, and the word accountability grew teeth. For Mary and Ethan, the revelation was complex, vindication braided with outrage. Mary's public pleas over the years, "Please, if anyone knows where my husband is," had been dismissed by some as grief's rhetoric. Now, with the ledger on the table, the plea transformed into a call for answers with legal and moral weight. Ethan, who had grown into a man shaped by the absence, read the journal's passages aloud to anyone who would hear, his voice steady where it had once been raw. He framed the discovery not as the final chapter, but as a turning point, a moment when silence surrendered to scrutiny. The town, stunned, had reached for a vocabulary of consequence. In the weeks after the trunk surfaced, Hollow Creek learned quickly that shock breeds an appetite for clarity, and that clarity demands process. The ledger had exposed an architecture of misdirection. How the community would respond to it, by forgiveness, by prosecution, by rebuilding, remained the question pulsing through every whispered conversation and printed headline. The reconstruction of that night came slowly, like a photograph emerging in a darkroom, frame by frame, until the full image of horror could no longer be ignored. Investigators began with the trunk's contents, then triangulated witness statements, bank records, and finally the confessions that Harold and Glenn could no longer evade. Each piece of evidence revealed not just what happened, but how carefully the crime had been orchestrated, the meticulous choreography that transformed a sanctuary into a scene of betrayal and death. It had begun innocuously enough, or so it seemed from the outside. Daniel had called for a meeting with the church's finance committee late on a Thursday evening. Harold and Glenn were both present, as always, appearing the picture of devoted stewards. They listened while Daniel spoke softly, almost cautiously, outlining discrepancies in donation tracking, noting transfers that did not reconcile with the official ledger. He paused, letting the names and figures sink in, then raised his gaze, steady, almost pleading. "These funds are not ours. They belong to the people, to the work we promised to do. Misuse will not remain hidden." The words, documented in the journal in meticulous handwriting, had been written not in fear, but in a deliberate, careful cadence. Daniel had already sensed the tension that months of mismanagement had built. The way Harold and Glenn's casual justifications had hardened into protective instinct. He did not accuse them outright in his sermon that evening. Instead, he cloaked the warning in metaphor. What is hidden in darkness will be shouted from the rooftops. Only those who knew the ledger, who had read the discrepancies in the margins, could interpret the message. Investigators determined that after the congregation left, Daniel went to the basement to organize files, unaware that Harold and Glenn had followed him. What transpired there was reconstructed from forensic evidence, later corroborated by Glenn's admission. Daniel confronted them with the documents in hand, holding the ledger, the letters, the evidence of their diversion of funds. Panic and fear flickered in Harold's eyes, sharpened by the understanding that exposure meant prison, ruin, and public disgrace. Glenn's initial hesitance quickly turned into aggression. He had been complicit, but now saw the stakes in stark clarity. The struggle began quietly, almost silently. Marks on the basement walls, scratches on the stone steps, smudges of ink across the journal, all suggested Daniel's resistance, his desperate attempts to protect the documents. The ink smeared in the journal, running as if it had been wiped in a frantic swipe. Entries ended mid-sentence, words interrupted by violence, handwriting jagged where it had been torn or pressed under hands larger than Daniel's. The letters bound for Mary and Ethan were left behind, unopened, as though someone had intended them to survive only as fragments, warnings in limbo. Forensic analysis later indicated blunt trauma as the cause of death, delivered in the basement, where the physical confrontation had escalated beyond words. The investigators traced the effort to move the body. It was buried hastily in a shallow grave just a few miles from the church, in dense woodland that had once belonged to an acquaintance of Glenn's family. The location had been chosen for accessibility and seclusion, a combination that suggested planning rather than panic. Soil samples, recent disturbance of leaf litter, and irregular tree growth corroborated the grave's age. Even in their confessions, Harold and Glenn revealed the internal calculus that led to murder. Fear of exposure overrode faith, ambition overrode morality, and both men, steeped in the illusion of stewardship, rationalized the act as the only way to protect the church. They had believed no one would connect the disappearance to them because the town had long deferred to their authority, had accepted the elders' unchallenged presence as the measure of truth. Their confidence in the community's silence, combined with the elaborate falsification of the ledgers, had created a veneer of invulnerability that lasted over a decade. Daniel's journal, letters, and ledgers, recovered from the trunk, were the keys to unraveling the scheme. The documents allowed investigators to chart the final hours with precision, to match dates, times, and financial anomalies with testimony and forensic evidence. Each piece of paper served as a silent witness to his final efforts, to expose wrongdoing, to warn his family, and to maintain moral authority, even in the face of lethal betrayal. The trunk's discovery had turned a series of unexplained absences and rumors into a coherent narrative of crime and deception, a story that confirmed the suspicions Ethan had carried for years and validated the intuition that had never allowed him to believe his father had simply vanished. The revelation shocked the town, not just because of the crime itself, but because it had been committed in the heart of a house of worship. Harold and Glenn, who had stood at the pulpit beside Daniel, had transformed authority into a weapon, faith into leverage. For parishioners, it was a collapse of trust so deep that the air of Hollow Creek seemed to tremble with it. Yet within that tremor lay the first seeds of resolution. The truth, buried but never gone, had finally been unearthed. And Daniel's legacy, his warnings, his meticulous record-keeping, his attempts to shield his family, would now guide the pursuit of justice. The courtroom was thick with tension, the kind of oppressive atmosphere that presses against your chest and makes every breath feel measured and deliberate. Hollow Creek's residents had packed the benches, some standing along the walls, their eyes fixed on Harold Barnes and Glenn Matthews as though their gaze alone could expose the depths of guilt that documents and confessions had already laid bare. For 13 years they had accepted the elders' smiles, their comforting words, the hollow reassurance that all was well in St. Andrews. Now those same faces, once trusted, now revealed as instruments of deceit, sat behind the defense table, hands folded, expressions tight, as if their carefully constructed veneer of innocence might still hold under scrutiny. Whispers had turned to mutters, mutters to low roars of indignation, and by the time Mary Whittaker took the stand, the courtroom was a furnace of collective rage. She was lean, her posture taut, her voice trembling only slightly as she faced the men responsible for her husband's disappearance. Her eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights and years of uncertainty, cut through the calm that Harold and Glenn attempted to feign. "You stole not just his life, but his memory," she said, each word deliberate, sharpened with the justice she had carried in silence. "You left us in silence. You left me to raise my son alone. You betrayed every trust in this room." Her declaration was met with a collective intake of breath, the sound of the congregation's moral equilibrium snapping under the weight of truth. Parishioners had spent years reconciling absence with hope, rationalizing Daniel's disappearance, constructing stories that kept grief bearable. Some believed he had abandoned them, others had whispered of scandal. None had imagined murder at the hands of the two men they had trusted most. Now anger erupted like a river freed from a dam. People leaned forward from the pews, fists clenched, voices low but resolute. Comments passed quietly at first, then grew louder, muttering accusations, curses, and demands that went beyond the bounds of courtroom decorum. Each ledge of rage was fueled by betrayal, the depth of which could not be quantified merely in dollars or documents, but in the lived experience of years spent in manipulated faith. The prosecutor displayed the evidence again, letting each ledger, journal entry, and letter speak for itself. The room listened to the weight of Daniel's handwriting, to the jagged smears of ink where the journal had been wrested from him in his final moments. He had tried to protect not only the congregation's trust, but also his family's future. Every note, every calculation revealed the pattern of premeditation that Harold and Glenn had employed, each line an indictment beyond the spoken word. Parishioners leaned in, some gripping the benches, faces pale, as the ledger's arithmetic translated into human betrayal. This was not simple fraud. It was a moral crime, executed in the very space where faith and accountability were supposed to coexist. Anger was not a silent companion. It manifested in sighs, muttered curses, and the occasional audible gasp when the scope of the deception became clear. Volunteers who had once helped count the collection plates exchanged incredulous glances. Members of the Finance Committee, some of whom had been complicit unknowingly, now recoiled in horror at the realization that the infrastructure of trust had been weaponized against them. Conversations in the hallways after the initial hearings were sharp, clipped, and raw with emotion. No one could speak without invoking betrayal, and the weight of unspoken grievances, accumulated over more than a decade, pressed on everyone present. Mary's son, Ethan, now grown, stood nearby, shoulders squared, though his eyes glistened. For years he had carried the absence of his father as a private burden. Today that absence transformed into public outrage, a righteous fury that mirrored the collective grief of the town. Every ledger page, every page of Daniel's journal, validated not just his father's disappearance, but the moral compass he had tried to preserve in a community that had been led astray. Harold and Glenn remained seated, their faces pale, mouths pressed into tight lines. Their attempts at composure faltered under the gaze of the congregation, under the weight of accumulated outrage. Each person in the courtroom understood that the betrayal was not abstract. It had been personal, intimate, a violation of shared faith, and for some, a spiritual wound, as well as a civic one. Rage hung in the room like a living thing, thick and almost visible, fueled by years of speculation and sorrow finally given form. Even the judge, seasoned and steady, had to pause as Mary's words resonated through the chamber, echoing not only her grief, but the moral reckoning the entire town had been waiting to witness. Outside, the murmurs in the courthouse hallways swelled into conversations that could not be ignored. Families discussing the betrayal of men they had trusted, neighbors recounting charitable donations that had been redirected, and a community collectively grappling with the depth of deception that had existed in their midst for more than a decade. Hollow Creek was no longer merely shocked, it was awake, alert, and incandescent with the kind of anger that demands accountability. The courtroom was silent the morning the sentence was read, a hush that carried the weight of 13 years of absence, fear, and unspoken grief. Harold Barnes and Glenn Matthews sat side by side, their shoulders slumped, faces pale beneath the glare of the overhead lights. The judge's gavel struck the bench with a crisp authority, each tap echoing like a heartbeat through the chamber. For the crimes of murder, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice, the judge intoned, voice steady but resolute. You are hereby sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The words fell like a final verdict, not just on the Iowa men, but on the silence and betrayal that had haunted Hollow Creek for over a decade. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered that had grown over the weeks of the trial. People who had once whispered in doubt, now standing together in a shared clarity of purpose and outrage. Families clutched one another, hands gripping tightly as the sentence was read aloud. Some cried quietly, others stared straight ahead, their faces hard with the satisfaction that justice, long delayed, had finally arrived. Ethan stood at the edge of the crowd, fists clenched around a folded copy of his father's journal. He felt the slow, grounding release of a burden lifted, the tangible proof that the years of uncertainty and anger were not in vain. For him, for Mary, for every parishioner who had mourned, the sentence was more than punishment. It was confirmation that the truth could not be buried, no matter how deep. Back at St. Andrew's Church, the atmosphere was both reverent and charged with emotion. The sanctuary had been cleaned, repaired, and rededicated in Daniel's honor. Fresh flowers lined the windowsills. Sunlight streamed through stained glass, casting colored patterns onto polished wooden pews, and a quiet hum of prayer filled the air. Parishioners moved with a careful purpose, as if each step was an acknowledgment of the suffering endured and the justice achieved. The walls, once heavy with the tension of unresolved grief and suspicion, now seemed to breathe with a sense of closure. Ethan ascended the steps to the pulpit, the worn wood familiar beneath his hands. His father's Bible lay on the lectern, its leather cover softened by decades of devotion. He placed it back in its rightful place with deliberate care, feeling the weight of continuity and reconciliation in the gesture. This act, simple in execution but monumental in meaning, symbolized the restoration not just of the church, but of the moral order that Daniel had tried to uphold. The congregation watched in quiet reverence, understanding that this placement was not merely symbolic, it was the physical manifestation of a truth that had survived threats, lies, and violence. Mary stood nearby, the lines of grief still etched in her face, but softened by relief and pride. For 13 years she had been the keeper of absence, holding her son steady against the currents of doubt and rumor. Now, with the sentence pronounced and her husband's name cleared, she could exhale fully for the first time in more than a decade. Her gaze swept over the congregation, over the altar, and rested briefly on the pulpit where Ethan had placed the Bible. It was a moment of quiet reclamation, the reclamation of her husband's memory, of their family's dignity, and of the church's trust. The community, too, felt the impact of resolution. The scandal that had fractured relationships, faith, and daily life had been addressed with legal finality. Parishioners who had argued, doubted, or feared for the church's integrity now began the slow process of healing. Meetings that had once been tense and accusatory shifted into planning committees, volunteer schedules, and communal efforts to honor Daniel's principles. The financial misdeeds, meticulously documented in the recovered ledgers, were addressed under court supervision, ensuring that donations were restored and future oversight implemented. In the quiet moments after the rededication, Ethan lingered at the pulpit, running his fingers over the pages of the Bible. Each verse was a tether to the man he had never fully known, but whose absence had shaped him. For the first time, the family's name, Whitaker, was spoken without suspicion, without shadow, with acknowledgment of both suffering and courage. The years of unanswered questions, of whispered rumors, of moral ambiguity had given way to clarity, accountability, and honor. Justice had been delivered not as a fleeting concept, but as a tangible, lived reality. Hollow Creek exhaled collectively, and within that exhale lay both relief and the quiet, enduring promise that the truth, no matter how long buried, would always find its way to light. The morning of the memorial service dawned crisp and clear, a pale sun filtering through the clouds like a promise of clarity after years of shadow. St. Andrew's Church, meticulously restored in Daniel's honor, was filled to capacity, the pews heavy with faces etched by grief, resilience, and the long accumulation of uncertainty. The air was thick with the mingling scents of polished wood, candle wax, and fresh flowers, a tangible weight of reverence pressing on the gathered congregation. Outside, the quiet murmur of the crowd waiting to enter mirrored the tension within. Every footstep, every murmur carried the collective memory of 13 years of unanswered questions, whispered speculation, and moral disorientation. Mary Whitaker stood at the pulpit, her hands resting lightly on the well-worn surface, her eyes scanning the room that had been the site of both her family's greatest hope and deepest sorrow. She wore a simple navy dress, her posture upright but imbued with a solemn gravity that reflected the culmination of years spent balancing grief with the need for strength. When she opened the leather-bound journal, its cover cracked at the spine from decades of care. A hush swept over the room, as if the building itself recognized the weight of what was about to be spoken. Each congregation member leaned forward slightly, not wanting to miss a single syllable, aware that these were the final words of a man whose voice had been silenced, but whose spirit had endured. Mary's voice, initially quiet and measured, gained strength as she read the passage Daniel had written mere hours before his disappearance. "If truth costs me everything, then everything is worth the price." The words seemed to reverberate through the sanctuary, each syllable heavy with sacrifice, courage, and unwavering moral clarity. There was an almost tangible stillness as the congregation absorbed the final testament of the man who had been absent for over a decade. Some faces wet with tears, others pale from the sudden rush of recognition that the truth had finally emerged from the shadows, unvarnished and complete. The journal, a silent witness to both Daniel's intellect and his moral fortitude, revealed not just a record of financial discrepancies and threats, but also the interior life of a man who had been confronted with impossible choices. Each page that had survived the trunk's years-long imprisonment was a blueprint of integrity, a testament to foresight and determination that defied the cruelty and cowardice of those who had sought to silence him. In this room, the weight of 13 years of silence, suspicion, and fear seemed to lift incrementally with every phrase Mary read aloud. Families who had been divided by rumor and uncertainty now found themselves united in grief, transformed into clarity. Ethan, standing beside his mother, felt the gravity of the moment pressing in layers. He had grown into a young man, forged in the crucible of absence, shaped by questions that had never had answers. Watching his mother read Daniel's words, he sensed the subtle alchemy of relief. The closure that had been denied him for so long now arrived in the form of finality and understanding. Each person in the congregation felt it differently, some through tears, some through the quiet contraction of breath as the enormity of truth sank in. But collectively, there was a sense of release, a long-delayed exhale that had been held in suspense for over a decade. The memorial did not linger in rumor or accusation. It honored the painstaking unearthing of facts, the bravery required to confront lies, and the enduring commitment to moral clarity. The church walls, once sites of whispered speculation and concealed betrayal, now resonated with the affirmation of justice realized. Parishioners, many of whom had lived under a cloud of mistrust, now experienced a catharsis that transcended legal verdicts or media coverage. Relief permeated the room, not as a fleeting emotion, but as a profound shift in collective consciousness. A recognition that the labyrinth of deception had been navigated, that accountability had been imposed, and that the memory of a life taken too soon had finally been honored with truth. As Mary closed the journal, a wave of stillness followed, a silence born not of absence, but of completion. The congregation remained seated, letting the resonance of Daniel's final words settle into their consciousness, each heartbeat a testament to endurance, each sigh a recognition of the long arc toward resolution. In that moment, relief was not simply personal,